They called it the Great White Hurricane. The winter of 1888 didn't arrive with a gentle warning or a polite chill in the morning air. It fell upon the plains like a judge's gavel, a sudden unforgiving death sentence for anyone caught miles from a hearth. Out in the vast frozen throat of Bitter Creek, the wind didn't just blow. It screamed. It was the kind of cold that didn't just bite the skin. It snapped. The bones turned the blood to slush and froze the breath before it could even leave your lungs. Silas Thorne was not looking for a miracle, and he certainly had no intentions of playing the hero. He was just a solitary, hardened rancher, 30 miles from nowhere, trying to push his last stray cattle back to the barn before the storm swallowed the world entirely. He rode with his head bowed, trusting the blind instincts of his gelding far more than his own frost-blurred vision. Silas was a practical man. He knew the cattle were already lost. To keep searching meant joining them in the frozen dirt. He had made the grim, quiet decision to turn back. His hands, though wrapped in thick leather, were losing their feeling. All he wanted was the smoke of his own chimney and the harsh bite of black coffee. But then he saw it. A jagged break in the endless, suffocating white. A flash of pale blue fabric. Silas pulled back on the heavy leather reins, bringing his exhausted horse to a halt. A long, excruciating silence stretched out between the beating of his heart and the howling of the wind. It would have been so much easier to ride on. It would have been easier to close his eyes and pretend it was nothing but a piece of torn canvas. Stopping meant putting his life on the line for a stranger who was likely already gone. But the rigid, unwritten code of the frontier tugged at his conscience. With a heavy sigh that plumed into the frozen air, he waded into the drift, the snow pushing against his thighs like heavy, wet cement. Falling to his knees, he clawed at the frozen crust until his bare fingers ached with a dull, burning pain. And there she was, left for dead. Her skin held the terrifying stillness of marble. Silas pressed his fingers against her icy throat. For a terrible moment, there was nothing. And then, a flutter. A pulse so desperately thin, it felt like the heartbeat of a dying sparrow. She was drowning in the white, but she hadn't sunk to the bottom just yet. Without a single word, Silas gathered her fragile weight into his arms, wrapping her in his own coat and sacrificing his meager warmth. He mounted his horse, placing her across the saddle, and turned back into the teeth of the screaming wind. He was taking her home. It took him 2 grueling hours to cover the final miles fighting a storm that wanted nothing more than to bury them both. Stepping into the cabin was like stepping into another world, a sanctuary of wood smoke and heat. As the hearth fire roared to life, it slowly chased the deathly chill from the room, and the ice clinging to the woman's clothes began to melt into dark, damp patches. Silas didn't know her name. He didn't know what kind of desperation would drive a person out into the great white hurricane. He only knew she was slipping away. As he worked to pull the frost from her skin, the dancing firelight painted a map of his own life across his hands. They were the hands of a man who had wrestled steers in the mud-built fences in the blistering heat and spent more of his years talking to animals than to human beings. He was a man carved by the isolation of the frontier, hardened, solitary, and silent. Yet as he wiped the melting snow from her brow, there was a profound, quiet reverence in his touch. In the West, you didn't ask questions about how someone ended up broken on your doorstep. You simply fixed what you could. And then the ice broke. She didn't wake up with a peaceful sigh or a flutter of eyelashes, like a damsel from a penny dreadful. She woke with a violent start, her gray eyes darting around the shadowed cabin, wide with sheer terror. Even pale, shivering, and stripped of whatever life she had known before, she did not look like a helpless victim. the way she set her jaw fighting through the agonizing, burning pain of her blood thawing. She looked like a survivor, someone who had been running for a very long time from something far worse than the cold. Silas read the profound fear in her posture. He knew that to a cornered Mustang, any sudden movement was a threat. So he offered the only two things he had of value: warmth and distance. By retreating into the shadows and leaving the hot broth within her reach, he established the first unspoken rule of their shared isolation. His silence told her everything she needed to know, Asta. I pulled you from the grave, but I do not own you. You are safe here, and I will not cross this line. It was a quiet respect, a boundary drawn not with words, but with the steady, reassuring presence of a man who knew when to fade into the background. Time loses its shape when the world outside is buried in an endless sea of white. Days bled into weeks, marked only by the dwindling pile of stacked firewood and the steady rhythmic sounds of frontier survival. The blizzard refused to break piling snow up to the eaves and locking them inside a universe made entirely of rough-hewn wood. Wood smoke and shared silence. But as the days passed, the silence between them began to change. It was no longer the heavy, suffocating silence of fear or the tense quiet of two strangers waiting for an attack. It became a language of its own. In the brutal expanse of the West, words were often cheap commodities, easily used to weave lies, make hollow promises, or deliver cruel threats. Silence, however, was painfully honest. They learned each other's rhythms without ever saying, "Good morning," or asking prying questions about the scars they both carried. It was a delicate choreography of two ghosts learning to occupy the same haunted space without colliding. The heavy, measured thud of Silas's boots on the floorboards announced the dawn, a reassuring sound that told Clara the fire had been stoked and the cabin was safe. The soft rustle of her movements by the stove promised a hot meal and the bitter, earthy smell of roasted coffee beans. Silas learned that Clara slept facing the door, a lingering habit of deeply rooted trauma, so he made sure never to approach her from behind. Clara learned that Silas took his coffee black as tar, always drinking it, while staring into the dancing flames lost in memories he refused to speak of. They existed solely in the present tense, finding a strange, profound comfort in the simple, mundane chores of staying alive. Silas wasn't just mending a piece of ruined leather. He was restoring her mobility. He was putting the ability to run away back into her own two hands. To a woman who had been hunted, owned, and discarded, that gesture carried the weight of a canyon. It was the ultimate absolute act of trust to leave the door to the cage wide open and wait to see what the bird would do. When their fingers brushed his rough, calloused hands against her pale, healing skin, the air in the cabin seemed to shift, growing suddenly dense. It was the first time they had truly looked at each other, not as a savior and a victim, but as a man and a woman. There were no grand theatrical declarations of affection, no sweeping romantic words that belonged in city parlor rooms. Out here, love didn't announce itself with fireworks. It seeped into your bones, like the slow warmth of a wood stove. As the howling wind outside finally began to lose its furious edge, settling into a low, mournful moan, a different kind of storm was quietly breaking inside the cabin. An unspoken, undeniable pull. Clara looked at the patched boot in her hands, and for the first time in a very long time, she realized she had absolutely no desire to run. The profound cruelty of the frontier is that it eventually thaws. Winter is a merciless, brutal killer, but it is also a perfect, pristine blanket. It hides the rot buries the tracks, and grants a temporary frozen amnesty to those who are running. But as the sun finally broke through the bruised, heavy clouds, turning the impassable snowdrifts into a treacherous sea of dark, sucking mud, the sanctuary of the cabin was breached. The past, as it always does in the unyielding West, had diligently followed the thaw. It didn't arrive with the dramatic, booming clash of thunder. It arrived with the sickening, wet thud of approaching hooves. Elias Vance was not a man of the wild. He was a parasite of civilization. He was the kind of man who carried a cheap tin badge, not to uphold the law, but to legally excuse his own sadism. He dealt in ledgers, desperate debts, and human flesh. He was the creeping shadow that Clara had been fleeing when the blizzard caught her. For Elias, a human being was nothing more than numbers in a black book, a piece of property to be collected, used, and discarded when the value ran dry. When Clara heard the specific, arrogant cadence of his voice barking orders at his men in the yard, the healing warmth of the cabin instantly vanished. The blood in her veins turned back to ice. The illusion of safety shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. But as she retreated into the darkest corner of the room, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs like a trapped bird, she saw the broad, unmoving silhouette of Silas Thorne filling the doorway. He did not look back at her. He didn't ask her who the riders were or what sins she had committed. He simply stepped out into the bitter spring air, pulling the heavy wooden door shut behind him, sealing her inside the only safe place left in the entire world. Elias Vance spoke with the oily, practiced confidence of a man who was entirely used to dealing with cowards and broken spirits. He leaned lazily over his saddle horn, his breath forming sour gray clouds in the chilly spring air, and demanded his property. He spoke of Clara not as a breathing woman, but as a stolen horse, a breached business contract, an unpaid ledger debt that he had every legal right under God, and the territory to reclaim. He expected the solitary rancher to quickly step aside. He expected the familiar, intoxicating scent of fear. Instead, he found a wall of absolute, terrifying stillness. Silas Thorne didn't flinch when Elias's men unholstered their rifles. He didn't raise his voice to match the bounty hunter's aggressive, performative barking. In a chaotic world full of loud, boasting men who hid their deep-seated cowardice behind rapid gunfire and whiskey courage, Silas possessed the deadly quiet gravity of a man who had already made his peace with the dirt. He stood in the sucking mud, his massive hands resting easily at his sides. His eyes locked onto Elias with the cold, unblinking intensity of an apex predator, patiently calculating the exact geometry of a kill. When Silas finally spoke, his voice was a low, gravelly rumble that barely carried over the sound of the dripping water. Yet it cut through the outlaw's bravado like a freshly stropped straight razor. "Out here," Silas said, the words heavy and devoid of emotion. "The only thing a man owns is his word and the dirt he's buried in. You're standing on my dirt, Elias. Leave." It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a negotiation. It was a simple, immutable law of the universe. Elias Vance looked down the barrel of that suffocating, quiet resolve and saw the terrifying truth. He saw a man who had absolutely nothing left in his life to lose. A man who would not hesitate for a fraction of a second to drag all three of them screaming into hell just to keep that cabin door closed. The blustering opportunist furiously weighed his greed against his own life, and his life won. The outlaws turned their horses and retreated, swallowed by the treacherous, muddy trail, leaving behind a silence that was heavier, darker, and infinitely more profound than the winter storm had ever been. The human body can only hold back the crushing tide of terror for so long before the dam inevitably breaks. When the immediate visceral threat of Elias Vance finally faded into the muddy twilight, the sheer adrenaline that had kept Clara's spine miraculously straight and her jaw tightly locked, completely drained away. It left nothing behind but the raw, bleeding, invisible wounds of her past. She collapsed by the warm hearth, not out of sudden physical weakness, but under the immense, suffocating weight of a deeply rooted memory she could no longer outrun. For the very first time since she had opened her startled gray eyes in that lonely cabin, the hardened, impenetrable armor cracked, and the fierce survivor gave way to the utterly terrified woman underneath. She wept with the agonizing, desperate intensity of someone who had been holding their breath under dark water for years. And then, between the violent, ragged sobs that shook her delicate shoulders, the ugly truth finally spilled out into the quiet room. She didn't speak to beg for Silas's pity. She was far too proud for that. She spoke to explain the monster he had just turned away from his door. Her voice, hoarse and trembling, painted a grim picture of a desperate arrangement, a father's crippling, unforgivable gambling debts selfishly traded for her absolute freedom. She spoke of binding ledgers signed in her own metaphorical blood, of a vibrant life, brutally reduced to a mere line item in a cruel man's black book. She confessed that she had deliberately chosen the freezing, deadly embrace of the great white hurricane, because the cold, indifferent, and absolute death of winter was infinitely kinder than the suffocating, degrading cage Elias Vance had built for her. Silas didn't offer her hollow, meaningless platitudes. He didn't insult her intelligence by telling her that the world was a fundamentally fair place, or that the nightmares would magically disappear with the sunrise. He knew better than anyone that the merciless western frontier was a vast, unforgiving graveyard of broken promises and shattered dreams. Instead, he offered the only tangible truth he had left in his hardened soul. He crossed the heavy, creaking floorboards, intentionally closing the careful, respectful distance he had rigorously maintained since the very day he pulled her lifeless body from the ice. When he crouched beside her on the floor, the dying heat of the fire illuminating the deep, weathered lines of his stoic face, he didn't reach instinctively for his gun, and he didn't look out the window for enemies. He simply took off his gloves, exposing the scarred, deeply calloused skin of a man who had fought the brutal world and barely survived it, and he gently placed his massive, heavy hand over her trembling, fragile fingers. It was an immensely grounding touch, profoundly heavy and radiantly warm, effectively anchoring her violently drifting soul back to the safety of the present moment. In a harsh, transactional world that had treated her as absolutely nothing more than a commodity, a breathing debt to be aggressively collected and selfishly consumed. Silas's voice broke the silence. It was a low, steady rumble of absolute, unwavering conviction. "You aren't a debt to be paid, Clara," he whispered into the quiet night, the simple words, carrying the immense, unshakable gravity of a sacred vow. "You're a life to be lived." And in that dimly lit, isolated cabin, as the chilly spring wind rustled softly through the melting pine trees outside, the last stubborn remnants of the ice encasing Clara's heart finally shattered. She didn't pull away. Slowly, exhaustedly, she leaned her head toward his calloused palm, no longer running, no longer hiding, finally realizing she had found a place where she could just breathe. They say the American West is a vast, merciless graveyard of broken dreams, a brutal anvil where weak iron is relentlessly shattered, and only the hardest steel manages to survive. It is a land that takes and takes until there is absolutely nothing left to give. But what the old pioneers rarely talk about in their grim campfire stories is that occasionally, when the great storms finally break and the cruelest winters surrender to the sun, the frontier gives something back. It takes the shattered, bleeding pieces of two utterly ruined lives and forges them into something entirely new, something fundamentally unbreakable. The winter of 1888 had descended upon the Bitter Creek Valley like an unyielding judge, a terrifying white hurricane that sought to bury them both in anonymous frozen graves. Yet the crucible of that claustrophobic snowed-in cabin hadn't destroyed them. It had violently burned away the ghosts of their pasts. Clara didn't just survive the thaw. She learned how to truly thrive. She learned the rhythmic, peaceful language of the changing seasons, the reassuring weight of honest labor, and the unparalleled freedom of a horizon that belonged to absolutely no one. And Silas, the solitary, hardened stone of a man who had resigned himself to a life of silent emotional exile, found the one thing he didn't even realize he had lost a genuine reason to look forward to the dawn. Their life together wasn't a beautifully orchestrated fairy tale printed in a penny dreadful. The western sun still blistered their skin, the arduous ranch work still ached in their bones, and the winters would always return with their icy, howling threats. But the heavy, suffocating isolation was gone, replaced by a quiet, fierce devotion. They had built a fortress not just of rough-hewn pine logs and river stone, but of mutual, unspoken respect. Out in the vast, untamed wilderness, where words were cheap, they had written the most profound love story imaginable, using nothing but the steady rhythm of their daily chores, the comforting warmth of a shared hearth, and the simple, radical act of choosing to stand together against the howling dark.